The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 4, The American Founding and the Federal Era.
Chapters 15 through 17, the First Inauguration, 1789, the Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment and religious freedom.
After the Constitution was ratified, federal elections were held. George Washington was chosen as the first president, the only president in U.S. history to be elected with a unanimous vote. Members of Congress were also chosen from their respective states. The first federal Congress was responsible for drafting and approving the Bill of Rights, including the religion clauses of the First Amendment. Since 1/4 of them had been members of the convention that had actually framed the Constitution, this was undoubtedly the greatest congressional collection of constitutional experts ever seen in America. Therefore, to understand what the Constitution and the religion clauses for the First Amendment mean, examine the words and deeds of this specific Congress and, of course, America's first president, beginning with the first presidential inauguration. Washington's inauguration occurred in New York City, which served as the nation's capital during the first year of the new federal government. The preparations for that ceremony had been extensive. Everything was well planned and religious activities abounded. The newspapers reported the first activity of the inauguration. On the morning of the day on which our illustrious president will be invested with his office, the bells will ring at 9 o'clock, when the people may go up to the house of God and, in a solemn manner, commit the new government with its important train of consequences to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. An early hour is prudently fixed for this peculiar act of devotion and is designed wholly for prayer. As the parade carrying Washington by horse-drawn carriage to the swearing-in was nearing Federal Hall, officials realized that no Bible had been obtained for administering the oath. Widespread general custom, along with New York law, required that a Bible be part of the ceremony. Parade Marshal Jacob Morton therefore hurried off and soon returned with a large 1767 Bible. The inauguration ceremony took place on the balcony at Federal Hall, with a huge crowd gathered below watching the proceedings. The Bible was laid upon a crimson velvet cushion, and Robert R. Livingston, the Chancellor of New York, who had been on the committee of 5 that drafted the Declaration of Independence, administered the oath. Since there were no federal judges yet, they could not administer the presidential oath, which is the custom today. With the Bible opened at random to Genesis 49, Washington placed his left hand upon it, raised his right hand, and took the oath of office. Then bent over and reverently kissed the Bible. Washington and the other officials then departed the balcony and went inside Federal Hall to the Senate chamber, where Washington delivered his inaugural address. In that first ever presidential speech, Washington opened with his own heartfelt prayer. He then called on his listeners to remember and acknowledge God. Finishing his address, Washington offered his closing prayer. Moving on to the next inaugural activity, the Senate directed that the oath shall have been administered to the President. He, attended by the Vice President and members of the Senate and House of Representatives, proceed to St. Paul's Chapel to hear divine service. The House approved the same resolution, so the President and Congress, as an official body, thus went en masse to St. Paul's Chapel, where divine service was performed. At least 7 distinct religious activities occurred during this first inauguration, activities repeated in whole or part in every inauguration since. The use of the Bible to administer the oath, solemnifying the oath with various religious expressions such as placing a hand on the Bible and then kissing it, prayers offered by the President, religious content in the inauguration address, the president calling on the people to pray or acknowledge God, congressionally designated church worship services attended by the president and Congress, and finally, clergy-led prayers. With the president and Congress now officially in place, one of the first tasks was to respond to the states' requests for a federal Bill of Rights. Congress' responsibility was to create an explicit, though not necessarily an exhaustive, list of God-given rights to be protected from the interference of the federal government. The Declaration of Independence explained the concept behind this protection. In 45 words, it set forth 3 fundamental principles that later guided the creation of both state and federal Bills of Rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The first of the 3 principles is the official recognition that there is a Creator God, a power higher than government to which even it must be subject. As Thomas Jefferson reminded citizens, being a happy and prosperous people begins with acknowledging and adoring an overruling providence, which he identified as the first component of good government. The second principle is that there are specific God-given inalienable rights. The founders understood that some rights come from God and others from governments, but only those given by government may be regulated by government. Inalienable, also called unalienable or natural, rights come directly from God. Civil authorities are not to touch these rights. As constitutional signer John Dickinson affirmed, inalienable rights are those which God gave to you and which no inferior power has a right to take away. Alexander Hamilton concurred, attesting that they are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the aid of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. John Adams agreed, declaring inalienable rights cannot be repealed or restrained by human laws. They are rights derived from the great legislature of the universe. Among the inalienable rights God gives to every individual, the Founding Fathers identified the rights to life, liberty, property, self-defense, justice, speech, assembly, and religious liberty. These rights are given to every human by God Himself, and thus civil government cannot interfere with or regulate them. Then, after recognizing that there is a Creator God and that certain rights come directly from Him, the third principle set forth in the Declaration is the government's duty to protect these rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Samuel Adams affirmed that government was originally designed for the preservation of the inalienable rights. Thomas Jefferson agreed, declaring that government is to declare and enforce only our natural rights and duties, and to take none of them from us. It was on these principles that the founders had created various state bills of rights beginning in 1776, and it was upon these same principles that several delegates at the Constitutional Convention insisted on the addition of a federal Bill of Rights. To be clear, none of the founders at the Constitutional Convention had objected to protecting God-given rights, not even those delegates who voted against a federal Bill of Rights. They unanimously agreed that the government had no power to interfere with these God-given guarantees. The only reason some founders opposed adding the Bill of Rights was because they thought it unnecessary. The national government possessed only limited, enumerated powers. These powers did not include the ability to, for example, infringe upon the right to worship God according to one's conscience. So, why would it be necessary to pass a specific amendment stating that Congress cannot pass a law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, After all, as some explained at the convention, if the Constitution was silent on an issue, the federal government had no authority to address it. So there was no cause to worry about federal overreach. But other founders, while strongly agreeing that the government had no authority to regulate these rights, also believed firmly in what was known as the depravity of man. They did not trust government leaders to do the right thing all the time, and therefore insisted that they place written limitations on the government and its officials through the Bill of Rights. Eventually, both groups acknowledged that the Constitution must have a federal Bill of Rights, and the states submitted some 124 proposed constitutional amendments to the first federal Congress. Some were only technical or structural in nature, but many were substantive and addressed what to include in a Bill of Rights. From these latter proposals, Congressman James Madison, who had been ambivalent about a Bill of Rights, compiled a list of 20 amendments as a starting point for federal discussions. Congress rejected many of his proposals, substantially modified others, combined various parts, and have even created new language as needed. They eventually reduced his list to 12 amendments, which Congress adopted and then submitted to the states for ratification. Shortly after the House agreed to the final wording of those amendments, in which became the Bill of Rights, Congress unanimously asked President Washington to issue a proclamation calling for a day of prayer and thanksgiving. Washington happily complied, explaining in his proclamation that it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. Notice that Washington specified that nations, not just churches or individual Christians, but nations, have 4 distinct duties. They are to 1. Acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, 2. Obey His will, 3. Be grateful for His benefits, and 4. Humbly implore His protection and favor. Our Congress, presidents, and states have fulfilled this duty of official acknowledgments to God thousands of times across our nation's history. Of the 12 proposed amendments sent to the states, 10 were initially ratified and became our Federal Bill of Rights. Of the 2 proposals not initially ratified by the necessary 3/4 of the states, one was eventually approved by a sufficient number of states to become the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, which was added in 1992. The Bill of Rights was the capstone of the Constitution. It was built upon the biblical concept of protecting the rights that God had bestowed upon every individual. As U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren affirmed, I believe the entire Bill of Rights came into being because of the knowledge our forefathers had of the Bible and their belief in it. Freedom of belief, freedom of expression, of assembly, of petition, the dignity of the individual, the sanctity of the home, equal justice under the law, and the reservation of powers to the people. I like to believe we are living today in the spirit of the Christian religion. I like also to believe that as long as we do so, no great harm can come to our country. There are 5 freedoms that the First Amendment explicitly protects, including the rights of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The part of that amendment most misunderstood today, including by numerous courts, is its religious section, which simply states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Many today claim that this mandates a so-called separation of church and state, a phrase that appears nowhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. To them, this phrase means that governments can have nothing to do with religion in general, or Christianity in particular. Although the Bill of Rights originally applied only to Congress, almost all of the Bill of Rights now also apply to state and local governments through a modern legal doctrine known as incorporation. When members of the First Federal Congress wrote the First Amendment, they intended the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, to do exactly one thing: prohibit Congress from creating a national church, thus giving official preference to one specific religious denomination. The founders considered the idea of separating God from government, or making government purely secular, a ridiculous notion. They would never have agreed, or even proposed any measure that would have removed God and his principles from the public square. To the contrary, they repeatedly affirmed that to do so would mean the death of the nation. As George Washington succinctly reminded citizens, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. According to Washington, anyone who sought to remove religion or morality from government could not be considered a patriot or a true friend or a supporter of America. Founding Father John Witherspoon similarly declared, "He is the best friend to American liberty who is the most sincere and active in promoting true and undefiled religion, and who sets himself with greatest firmness to bear down profanity and immorality of every kind. Whoever is an avowed enemy of God, I scruple not to call him an enemy to his country." It is well known to previous generations that the Founding Fathers never intended to secularize civil affairs or withhold religious expressions from the public arena. Even Thomas Jefferson, the man who later described the First Amendment as creating a wall of separation between church and state, adamantly opposed the concept of a secular nation or a godless public square. In fact, he ensured the opposite by personally introducing religious activities directly into the public realm. For example, in 1774, while serving in the Virginia legislature, Jefferson introduced a resolution for a statewide day of fasting and prayer. And then in 1779, while serving as governor of Virginia, he issued a proclamation for a statewide day of prayer and thanksgiving. In 1789, Jefferson began serving in the federal government as Secretary of State for President George Washington, where he was in charge of laying out the city of Washington, D.C., including building the White House and the U.S. Capitol. He then became Vice President under President John Adams, and during this time, in late November 1800, Congress moved into the newly constructed U.S. Capitol building. 2 weeks later, in December 1800, with Theodore Sedgwick presiding over the House and Thomas Jefferson over the Senate, they approved a plan whereby Christian church services would take place every Sunday in the hall of the House of Representatives, the largest room in the Capitol building. The spiritual leadership for each Sunday's service would alternate between the chaplain of the House and the chaplain of the Senate, each of whom would either personally conduct the service or invite some other minister to preach. It was in this most recognizable of all government buildings that Vice President Jefferson attended church. 3 months later, when he became president, he continued faithful attendance at the church services in the Capitol.